So, Reverend Naomi, it's so good to catch you again. I have been reeling about our time in Brazil. It changed me in some interesting ways. I've been feeling great since I got back. I'm curious, what are some thoughts and feelings you've been having since we had such a great time in Brazil with our partners?
I find myself even more committed to undermining authoritarianism and religious nationalism because of the fact that we were able to hear firsthand accounts of how white Christian nationalism in particular is manifesting in Brazil. So I have a deeper appreciation for this as a global problem. I knew that,
Mhm.
but being on the ground and hearing folk talk about what it looks like in their context
Yeah.
has really deepened my resolve to help people wrap their minds around this movement and the implications of this movement. So, just a deeper appreciation for the international nature
Yeah.
of Christian nationalism. And I'm also sitting with many of our comrades in Brazil talked about how in Brazil there isn't pressure to bifurcate the self. We were in the room with people who were scholars and religious leaders and communications professionals, and that people lead fully integrated lives. And I admire that. And I want to figure out a way in my own life and in the lives of others I care about, encourage a kind of fuller integration, right?
Mhm.
I'm a religious leader. And sometimes that puts me in certain rooms, but not in other rooms.
Right.
And
Right.
then my background as a movement strategist, organizer puts me in some rooms and not other rooms. So
Right.
I just think that what I saw our colleagues in Brazil do was model an integrative work life that I think serves them well. And we would do well to mimic that kind of posture here in the United States.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you said that because I left reflecting as well that in that convening, the conversation over the 2 days had these voices, and it wasn't a kind of performative
Mm,
conversation. They were pushing and probing and being generous to learn, but also standing on what they think they have understood based on the research and the thoughts and the readings and the reflections that they put into it. But you're right that it was we do the kind of scholar activist separation, and then we talk bad about each other. I don't want to be all in my head, or I just want care about the actions. And it was a nice fluidity that we saw. And I've been wondering, how can we learn from
yeah.
the setting more? Because I'm trying to think through, and I'd be curious if you've had it where activists and other characters are in a room and they can ask the academics to use their intelligence to help answer questions that the activist has. So it's not a
Mm,
matter, here's what my research is telling me, but it's okay, here's the problem we're seeing on the ground. What do you know or have you read that would help us to do this thing, right? And so
hmm
part of what Horizons tries to do that dance, but I know it's sometimes people feel uncomfortable in the room, or it's too abstract, or it's not based on research. And then once you add the component of faith in it,
Right.
how would you help people to see what you and I benefited from? To see it's so helpful to get a lot of different people in the room to be honest with each other about what they're confronting and the possibilities that they have access to if they talk and listen well. Like, how would you make that case to somebody?
One thing that I experienced was through the invitation to this convening was a deeper sort of clarity and understanding about Christian nationalism in the US context, right? We were going to talk to Brazilians about white Christian nationalism in their context,
Right.
and that required me to refine and hone in
Yeah.
on my own understanding of white Christian nationalism in our context. And so I think the opportunity to talk with other folks from other countries about a topic that impacts us in the United States forces us to get clear on what's going on in the United States. And I think that's always a worthwhile activity. It can feel like talking to the choir, preaching to the choir often, because I'm talking to other researchers
Right.
who do this work, who live and breathe this
Yeah.
kind of research. I'm talking to other movement folk, right? So it's helpful to be forced to explain something in the US context And I can't take for granted that I'm talking to people in a room who can finish my sentences,
Right.
right? So it's helpful to be in that kind of space. So I think any scholar, researcher, activist who wants, again, a more clear understanding of what's happening in the US context, anybody who wants to be able to more profoundly articulate the issue
Yeah.
should try to do so in a context where people know nothing about your context, right? So I think that that's helpful. I also think, again, I was able to appreciate the extent to which the players in the Christian nationalist movement in the
Mhm.
United States are also influencing politics, religion, and culture in other places, right? It's one thing to read about it, it's one thing to know
Yeah.
the influence of the US in other settings, but to be able to draw a straight line essentially
Yeah.
between the Christian nationalism that we see manifested, the same personnel involved, the same messaging involved, right? I always think it's great to broaden one's analysis because it helps us come up with better strategy in general, right?
Mhm.
When you can see a problem from many different kinds of perspectives
Mhm.
and analyze it more fully, then you come up with better solutions in your individual context. And so I think that we need to be having more transnational conversations about the issues that plague our world. There's no downside, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so helpful. When you gave a presentation, I'm
Mhm.
sitting there and I'm rocking because I'm feeling spirit move. I mean that in the sense that the spirit of the moment you were able to harness. And some people think academic research is just a matter of dry, disconnected. Um, what you brought into the room was just captivating. People were, oh, this was so good. Yeah. So if you would, I would love for you just to offer kind of some of what you were sharing, because since we've left Brazil, some of our Brazilian colleagues have still given feedback about how what you said was helpful. I thought it
Mhm.
was extremely helpful for me to put certain categories in place and to try to find another way of thinking and talking about it to people who, pastors who are reaching out. Okay, hey, we're trying to think about this question, and they may not use like white Christian nationalism, but they're just what we're trying to figure out. What are the forces aligned against us, and how might we recognize
Mhm.
forces for a better response? So, can you help, like, just offer like how you were thinking about and what you share with our Brazilian colleagues, so that the larger audience of Horizons and people who follow you and follow myself can benefit from your work?
I appreciate that your kindness. I'm glad that what I was able to bring, which is rooted in the research of my colleagues at Political Research Associates and my own lived experience in Christian spaces, I'm glad that it resonated with folks. The one thing we tried to do was ground us in a definition of white Christian nationalism. And I put it in air quotes because this is a porous category, right?
Mm,
That some people leverage for political gain and other people are deeply entrenched in from a religious perspective. Like it's hard to pin down. But there are some definitions or some framings that I have found helpful. I think one that I brought to the space was Dr. Jamar Tisby's definition of white Christian nationalism, inspired by activist lawyer Andrew Seidel. He says that white Christian nationalism is an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control, right? So that definition doesn't pull any punches as it relates to the instrumentalizing of Christian ideas, Christian symbols, Christian texts
yeah,
to create a permission structure to morally justify the acquisition of political power and social control, right? What's really behind the white Christian nationalist movement
yeah,
is a quest for political power and social control. And so conversations that try to delegitimize white Christian nationalism by saying it's not Christian or it's bad Christianity are not really helpful when we realize that it's not even about being Christian, essentially, or it's not even about looking Christian, appearing to be Christian. It's about using Christian stuff
Yeah.
to open up a space
Yeah.
for political power to be amassed and wielded and for social control. I thought that was helpful
Yeah.
to categorize this as a political ideology and not a religious position.
Yeah.
Even though there are people who find themselves assenting to white Christian nationalists' beliefs because they happen to be in a congregation where their pastor is espousing those beliefs, right? And the everyday person in the pew may or may not be interested in political control and social control, but they happen to be under the leadership of white Christian nationalist pastors. We also talked about how white Christian nationalism is a continuum that
Mm-hmm.
people it's not really a binary, either you are or you aren't. It's
Mm-hmm.
more like a continuum. And what's really exciting is that there's more and more research about the sort of scale of white Christian nationalism. If we had to articulate this continuum in terms of a scale, what would that look like? What kinds of questions should we ask people to get at whether or not they're a white Christian nationalist in terms of their ideology?
Mm-hmm.
Asking the question, are you a white Christian nationalist, is essentially a non-starter because people who are involved in that movement rarely identify themselves in that way.
Yeah.
And so thinking about it as a continuum, the fact that some people in the United States affirm some white Christian nationalist beliefs, but not others, these scales are really effective. And so we talked about that. We talked about the fact that Americans in particular, not just white Christian nationalists, experience white Christian nationalism in their lives, right? We talked about the wide reaching influence of white Christian nationalism in everyday American life. So,
Mm-hmm.
for people of faith, for people who are not of faith, for people who are Christian, people who are not Christian, everybody stands to be influenced by the
Right.
surge of white Christian nationalism that we're experiencing in the United States. And so one of the things that we got to do from a strategy perspective is make clear the stakes for everyone,
Yeah.
right? Broaden the front that needs to be fighting against Christian nationalism, the proliferation of Christian nationalism, by making the case that everybody stands to be impacted in, I would say, negative ways
Yeah.
by the proliferation of white Christian nationalism. Talked about how white Christian nationalism isn't really new. It has shape shifted, it has evolved, it has morphed, depending on the conditions of the time, depending on the political climate of the time.
Yeah.
But white Christian nationalism has really been a part of America's landscape from the very beginning. And it's important to appreciate that so we can respond in ways that take seriously the fact that this is an old enemy that has newer tricks.
Yeah.
So that was an important piece. We named some personnel, some folks who are proud card carrying white Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
And we also named some folk who prefer to operate behind the scenes, but who have the purse strings in their hands and
Yeah.
are whispering in the ears of more visible political leaders. So it's important to know the range of folk who are invested in white Christian nationalism is broad, ranging from scholars who are
Yeah.
intellectually justifying white Christian
Yeah.
nationalism to religious leaders themselves,
Yeah.
to political leaders, right? So again, we shouldn't try to reduce white Christian nationalism to a handful of actors who happen to be most visible. We need to understand that it is a movement that has its communications component, has its fundraising component, right? It is a movement.
Yeah.
And we talked about the kind of shadow network that has subsidized and bankrolled the white Christian nationalist movement. It's important to follow the money.
Yes.
That this movement is not successful if it's not paid for by philanthropists and other wealthy folks
Right.
who, again, have political goals in mind as they continue to bankroll this movement. So those were some of the insights I
Yeah.
tried to bring to the room in Brazil.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions, and then we can pivot to maybe some things that you learned that you're applying already or that you are thinking about how to mobilize. But a couple of follow-up questions that I thought was interesting that I would love to hear you just say a little more about. One of our colleagues in the Brazilian context made the argument that when we think about a resistance, we need to think about it in terms of just far right actions, far right behaviors, far right ideology, and then we need to have a kind of separate white Christian nationalist discourse so that people who are being seduced by the rhetoric or the permission structure can be called into account based on their behaviors and political ideologies in one vein. And then Christians have a responsibility to work through the way that their belief structure is being misrepresented, right? So instead of trying to do both at the same time, I thought it was interesting that, okay, there is a permission structure there. And there are a lot of people seduced by the Christian ideals who don't quite see the far right implications, behaviors, sensibilities, right? It reminds me of the kind of discourse where you say, can you have racism without racists? And you say, oh, can you have white Christian nationalism without white Christian nationalists? And if you say, are you racist? I'm like, oh, no. Are you a white Christian nationalist? No. And yet your behaviors, the way you give permission to certain events, the way your norm is shaped by the norm of a white Christian worldview, like all those things are influencing. So I love the broad scope you gave. How are you thinking about making the permission structure more available so that people who are caught in the juxtaposition can have better information so that their ideals and their allegiance isn't hijacked? Because I remember pastoring a church and I remember doing seminary and I remember all the things. And sometimes you don't know how much the Christian doctrines has already been tainted by what you're describing. And sometimes to shift your views on the way your faith is being communicated, the way your faith is being articulated, the way your faith is being practiced, feels like you are losing your faith, or it feels like you're giving up your Christianity. And so I know some people who don't agree with a lot of what could be described as white Christian nationalism, but when you ask them to think about it and to pivot and give them history, they feel like you're asking them to leave Christianity. So we know that there are people who can see the political ideology, who can know its far right sensibilities. Our work on authoritarianism helps us to see the comparatively certain behavior patterns show up. But there's a large group of people who are like not sure. I'm Christian, don't know what it means. I want to hold on. I want to keep Jesus. I want to keep my salvation. And they need help. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how are you thinking about the people who are caught in the narrative and don't have a way of articulating another story that resonates and takes seriously their values, but gives them the capability to make a distinction between white Christian nationalism as a political practice and people who are striving to use those Christian symbols and categories to live their life well? Pastors who come to me usually are in that kind of juxtaposition. I can't be talking about white Christian nationalism. That's a non-starter. And the Christian categories are already so co-opted. I need something to help me to do this. So could you say more about how you're thinking about helping people to deconstruct the permission structure and give them tools to be able to make the distinctions you're making so clearly?
Yeah, this is a challenge because I think what the white Christian nationalist movement has done so brilliantly is exploit people's desire to be faithful. People just want to be faithful. And
Yes.
that means being obedient to their pastors. That means,
Yes.
and there's a large base of folk who have been organized into white Christian nationalist spaces unwittingly, without consent, without full consent, right? And those folks are very vulnerable. And so I think it's right to be thinking about how do we make arguments, how do we narrate this moment in a way that helps people to distinguish between Jesus's politics, the gospel's politics, and the co-opting, instrumentalizing of Christianity for a different kind of politic.
Yeah.
Really believe that a critical analysis is actually an act of faith, right? It is
Yes.
reflective of faithfulness,
Agreed.
right? And so I like to make the case that we love God with our minds and our bodies and our hearts, right? And there
Right.
is a kind of intellectual, analytical component to faith,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And what we need are thinking Christians. And this is not, I don't mean to
I know you're not
suggest,
saying they're not thinking Christians.
I
I hear
don't
you.
mean
Right.
to suggest
No.
that, but I think that helping people to understand that loving God with our minds is part of the mandate. And so what does that mean? That
Yeah.
means not checking your brain at the door of the sanctuary.
Yeah.
That means following the line from a spiritual conclusion, a theological conclusion, to a political one, right? There are political implications for the gospel, right? Saying that the last will be first has a political implication
Yeah.
because it has to do with who gets what, how resources are allocated, and who gets whose needs get prioritized, right?
Right.
And so helping people to see that it is an act of faith, it is reflective of faithfulness, it is reflective of a commitment to Christianity, to want to parse through what is the gospel's politic versus what is a politic that is being imposed upon the tradition,
Yeah.
right? It should, in my opinion, it should annoy people. It should irritate Christians to
Yes.
see the hypocrisies, what is passing for Christianity in our political sphere
Yeah.
right now,
Yeah.
that espousing Christian language but behaving in an ungodly way, that has to be dealt with. That has to be called out. Again, these are acts of faith, right? So I think affirming that analysis is not the opposite of faith, that rigor in reflection is not the opposite of faith, that in some ways actions speak louder than words. So you might hear something coming out of a religious leader or a political leader's mouth,
Mm.
but if they are behaving in a way that belies that
Right.
rhetorical witness,
Right.
then we ought to say
It's not
something. And
people.
so, one of the things that I had to do, the first thing I had to do when I began my process of deconstruction, is to restore my own trust in my own gut. There's a way that religiously, I don't want to say religiously conservative, because I think there's a distinction between being a conservative and like white Christian nationalism. I
Yeah.
want to
Sure. Sure.
make
I
that
agree.
distinction.
I agree.
But I grew up in spaces that told me to ignore my own sense, my own interpretation of the text, my own lived experience of God, right? And so I want people to trust that they have the tools that they need to rightly divide the words in the text,
Yeah.
to tell the difference between a false prophet and an authentic one, right? People have the skills, but they've been told that those skills
Yeah.
can't be trusted,
Sure.
right? That we can only look to these leaders
Yeah.
to help us determine what is true and what is not.
Yeah.
And that's not, to me, that's not what Christianity requires. A complete disregard for one's own intuition,
Mhm.
one's own innate sense of justice and fairness. So it takes trusting yourself and surrounding yourself with people who won't tell you that what you experience in your gut is
Yeah.
wrong. So, yeah, I think that you're right that there are people who feel caught between doing what they know intuitively is right and being ideologically aligned with folks who are publicly Christian but privately doing something very, very sinister.
Yeah. So let me do this. I wish I could just keep this conversation going, and we probably need to, because there are
Mm,
so many requests for people like yourself to
mm,
articulate, to have better platforms to articulate, and to articulate one statement, one podcast, one convening won't do it. People have been
yeah,
listening to certain ideas every Sunday, every Wednesday, every
yep,
Thursday, every Friday. They have devotionals, they have all kinds
yep,
of things. So they're getting indoctrinated with ideas
right.
constantly. Since I've
Mm,
left Brazil, I've been really trying to figure out like the ability to engage people with the Christian categories more regularly and give them alternative explanations and alternative actions associated with those concepts and those ideas seems to be the work, right? So it's not lecturing to them that this is wrong. It's
Hmm.
not telling them that somehow or another they're not Christian, but it is demonstrate expressions of faith. And I'm going to make the case that this is what the best expression of the Christian faith in this moment looks like. And again, this is a strategy, right? So there's a far right political where you're not talking about Christianity, you're talking about actions, you're talking about policy, you're talking about accountability, and we need to
Right.
focus part of our strategy on that. So that some of those distinctions was made for me that I'm like, okay, you know what, that makes sense. Because if you're not
Hmm.
Christian, trying to tell Christians about how not Christian they are is a waste of energy. If you're not
Hmm.
Christian, fine. You focus on the far right ideology that's causing harm. But if you are subscribing to Christianity, then the question becomes, how can we undermine the permission structure, the legitimacy that they have operating with impunity right now?
Hmm.
And I think that's the work for Christians to take on, that we need to defend our claims of faith by demonstrating what the light in darkness looks like. And
Hmm.
so I've heard and I've seen and I've tried to give actions to pastors and I've scaled it, right? So I've written some sermonic thoughts for some pastors to help them to think through how maybe certain ideas in the text have been exploited, whether in
Hmm.
their own thinking or they see these ideas showing up in their congregations and they need to figure out how to get ahead of it. Or similarly, there are pastors who are saying, okay, look, we need to figure out what to do now. And I'm like, okay, is your city a sanctuary city? If it is, then make sure that your faith community is aligned. Watch and pray. Have somebody at the school, have
Hmm.
somebody at checkpoints,
Hmm.
and it's part of your faith. You're praying and you're watching. And then if
Yeah.
something goes off, ICE shows up, some kind of challenge. Now you have the saints or people who believe in protecting the vulnerable to be there. Should we start thinking about peacekeepers in the church? I mean,
Hmm.
in our institutions. And so there's
Hmm.
all these ideas that are all over the place. And those are just some. And so Brazil helped me. Here is
Hmm.
how you practice your faith in
Hmm.
your backyard. And then here is the story says, and we overcome by the words of our testimony.
Hmm.
That just share, here is how I'm walking by faith right now. And I
Yeah.
believe that those expressions, given articulation, given visibility, will actually be similar to what we saw when the church went in the street with the civil rights movement,
Hmm.
where you
Hmm.
give people a different expression of what God's children look like, how God's
Hmm.
children move in the world. And then
Hmm.
the person watching can say, oh, wait a minute. I find those characters, those actions more in line with what I really care about.
Hmm.
So that's how I'm thinking about it. And, what I'm trying to mobilize and get some kind of a network system working so that we can hear the stories, learn from the stories. People like yourself can articulate categories and help us to get a diet of different conversations of this. But that's
Hmm.
just me. Like a sense of urgency really kicked in with Brazil. But I want to hear what you're thinking about, how you're moving.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about what helps us to be able to go on offense and not just be defending all the time is internalizing in some ways the playbook of the opposition, those who are opposed to democracy, those who are opposed to equity and justice, right? There are patterns, there are moves, chess moves that I think the white Christian nationalist movement has used for years, forever, that we need to recognize and then respond to, right? So it's about giving people the vocabulary that they should be on the lookout for, right?
Mm,
Oh, when you hear somebody talking about the mountain mandate, you know what that is. You know what
mm,
that is. And you're not going to fall for that because you know what kind of ideology that's rooted in. When people try to rewrite American history to say that America is a Christian nation and it was founded as a Christian nation, right? Being armed, and forgive the kind of
Yeah, the militaristic.
militaristic metaphor, but being armed with information. At PRA, we say inform your resistance, right? Move from an informed place. So know who the local Christian nationalist characters are in your community. Know their names, right? Know what they're trying to do. Know who they're listening to and who influences them so you can get a sense. People ask me all the time, is there a map? Is there an org
Right,
chart
right. I get the
of
same
white
thing.
Christian?
Give
And
me the play.
it's not. There's not. We need to start doing some of that power mapping ourselves in our local communities, right? Because we're always on our back foot because we don't know
Know what
what
we doing? Yeah,
direction the assault is coming from.
yeah.
So it's about, as you get more informed, and you can do that by reading the wonderful stuff that Horizons puts out, the stuff that PRA puts out, get your toolbox full so that when it's time to go, you're ready to go. And so I think that information
Mm.
can be it's not a panacea, certainly,
Sure.
but it is helpful to know who the players are. What are the pieces of legislation that white Christian nationalists have been lobbying for in my own community, right? That takes some of the hand wringing and the
Mm.
what are we going to do about it
Yeah,
off the table, because we have a sense of what their plan is. And so now we can strategize with plays from our playbook.
yeah.
So I think reading all we can. There have been some wonderful pieces out recently in mainstream media that are trying to cover Christian nationalism more fully.
Mm.
In-depth investigative reporting, right? We need to be reading that stuff.
Yeah,
And I think that puts us in a position to make a play as opposed to always defending the play.
yeah.
I think that we also need to protect our profits. I feel like I'm a broken record because I say this every opportunity I can, right? Our profits, those who would speak out against the proliferation of this kind of religious nationalism,
Mm.
need to be protected and cared for, right? We can't continue to eat our own.
Oh,
We can't continue to do that. We need to make space and sanctuary for those who say, I'll go, I'll speak out, I'll preach that sermon,
yeah,
I'll go to that conference and disrupt it. Whatever it is,
yeah.
we need to protect our profits, because I think there are a lot of people who will be willing to be on the front lines against Christian nationalism, but they're not clear that people will have their backs. They're not clear that they'll be protected. And
Yeah.
so I think in terms of what institutions, congregations can do is
Mm.
build the infrastructure for a sanctuary for our prophets. We want our pastors to speak out, but then we throw them under the bus. And it's no, we need to protect our prophets so that we can contend with the narration of reality
Yeah,
that the far right has cornered the market on narrating
yeah,
this moment, providing us with the vocabulary,
yeah.
right? Who turned woke into a slur? Like, how did that even happen, right? We need more narrative power. And part of that is investing in prophets who will then inject a different kind of narrative into the discourse.
Yeah,
And so I really believe that we need the infrastructure to really keep our people safe as they do that.
yeah. Listen, Reverend Naomi, this has been so rich. I'm sure people are like, don't stop, don't stop. When y'all gonna be back on? Get her back, get her back.
We
So,
can take this on the road. We can do this.
listen, hopefully we can find some more avenues and vehicles, maybe set up conferences and do, instead of the revival where somebody come and preach, you bring people like yourself in and just sit,
Sure.
talk and just think through, because there's so many things we can do. But thank you so much. Brazil was great. I hope we get a chance to go to some other places, and I hope people I see you
Mhm.
as a prophet. And I hope we can continue to invest and not exploit your gift, but invest in it so that
Mhm.
we can create and scale and magnify the word that comes to us that can bring new life. My
All right,
sister.
the sermon close there. I see what you're doing. I see what you're doing.
This,
Thank you so much, Jarvis.
this has been great.